Historical fiction is one of the most popular genres in the book world, from critically acclaimed works like Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall series, detective and mystery books like C.J. Sansom's Disillusion or Ian Pear's An Instance of the Finger Post, fantasy and horror like Kim Newman's Anna Dracula, bodice ripper violence-orama like Wilbur Smith's Ancient Egypt series, or naughty dukes, rakes and other men that women shouldn't like but inevitably find themselves falling in love with, as found on your grandmother's bookshelf and also on my bookshelves because I love Mills and Boon romance novels. Also lots of children's books are historical fiction, including a book by your very own humble narrator. It's 5-star rated on Amazon. The current queen of historical fiction, and the one that I loved most as a teenager, is Philippa Gregory. And Philippa Gregory is pretty controversial in the worlds of both history and fiction. Her books pre her big break into mainstream recognition really managed to capture the sense of living in a different era, and she has a knack for dialogue and really fucked up things happening. But then Philippa Gregory got big and famous and critically recognised with The Other Boleyn Girl. The book was released in 2001 and Gregory became a relatively well-known household name, with her books receiving a level of attention and marketing that only authors with the largest pull can hope to achieve. Hollywood, the BBC, American mainstream television, interviews, appearances on historical documentaries, making her own historical analytical books. All of these allowed Gregory to make two decisions. One, that she was so great and amazing she no longer needed the services of an editor, and that's just the writer in me talking. And two, that she was a serious historian doing groundbreaking work that must be taken super seriously.
When I'm writing these books, I have to do quite specialist research into quite specialist areas, because you can't write about the later years of Henry VIII without really addressing the question of his health. I mean, he gets extraordinarily fat, hugely overweight. He's obviously sick, he's got some wound in his leg. He's obviously tremendously ill. He's nauseated a lot of the time. And my opinion is that really from the time of probably the death of Anne Boleyn, he's becoming mentally ill. He's actually mad, I think, by the time he executes Catherine Howard.
One of them said that your book is very important to her, and that when she reads it, she feels as though she's becoming Anne, and it affects her relationship with her boyfriend, because she'll find that she thinks, what would Anne do? Oh, she'd argue with him now. As a historian, how does hearing something like that make you feel?
Well, I am a historian, so I work with documents and I work with the recorded facts, and I try, well, when I'm being a historian, I take a reasonably objective view of the evidence, and I sort it and weigh it and, do the usual academic judgments that you should do with material.
Open up the back of her books and you'll see a cited bibliography of works as if it's, a work of historical analysis. It lists her research and presents her opinions and theories. She sells her works as being entirely derived from critical research and entirely accurate, with her work bringing an illuminating light to the female experience of historical, mostly Tudor life. To any reader just picking this up without any prior knowledge of the period, it would feel like a work of historical reality, with a little narrative flair added to make it flow as a novel. Thing is that Philippa Gregory is not a historian. In the words of Susan Bordeaux, Gregory's work as a historian is self-deceptive and self-promoting chutzpah. Let's look back again at the bibliography she cites in some of her books. Not all books and sources are made the same. There are some works that are outstanding and groundbreaking and change how we perceive the past, and there are some that are trash, based on nothing, or just no longer relevant because of their age. Knowing the schools of thought that historians belong to, having a decent understanding of historiography, see my previous video for what that is, and knowing how peers receive a historian's work lets a historian know and be able to tell what I'll technically call bullshit from non-bullshit. And that's a problem for Gregory. She just doesn't seem to have the understanding of history as a critical school of study. She frequently uses controversial or discredited works, or relies on works that have been rendered outdated by the revising works of other historians. Sources determine the limits of history, what can be explored, what cannot be explored. Hypothesis and speculation must not take the place of carefully evaluated evidence. The professionalism of the historian lies in reading such partisan material critically. Gregory lacks the critical skill to determine useful work from bad ones. She reads everything and seems to have no frame of reference to tell them apart. She tells the reader that her works are based on fact. But how much fact is really in them? Let's take a look at the work that established her as the most popular historical fiction writer of our time, the Other Boleyn Girl. What's fact and what's fiction? For those that haven't read the 2001 book The Other Boleyn Girl, here's a quick summary of the plot. Mary Boleyn is a naive, sort of virgin teenager who just isn't like other girls. She's the daughter of prominent members of Henry VIII's court, and he decides to woo and seduce her in all her 14-year-old charm, so you get the wonderful experience of reading a child being groomed by an adult man, and that's fine. This is despite the fact that she's married to one of Henry's good friends, William Carey, who's fine with everything because he gets money out of it. Mary has children by Henry, who is trying to separate from his wife as he has no legitimate child to inherit the English throne. However, Mary's politically ambitious and manipulative bitch sister is sent in to seduce Henry so that the Boleyns and their family can have power. Henry and Anne go through a long process of trying to get married, and Anne gets more and more vindictive and bad through the evils of ambition, while the now widowed Mary is just trying to do good. Henry and Anne manage to get married, as does Mary to some low-ranking nobody called William Stafford. Anne has a baby, a girl, which is bad, and her relationship with Henry deteriorates because she's wicked and can't be loved. Mary gets pregnant, so a secret marriage comes out, and she's exiled from court for a while, and then comes back, and it turns out that all Anne's friends are wicked, degenerate gay men, and it's implied that she's trying to conceive a child to please Henry by having sex with her gay brother George. Henry falls in love with a docile, compliant, and stupid woman called Jane Seymour, but they can't possibly get married because Henry went through all this trouble to marry Anne, including killing friends, changing laws, and founding an entire new church. But his first wife dies, and Anne miscarries a nightmare baby that is implied to have been fathered by a brother, so Henry instigates a plot against Anne, and she and her friends are arrested and executed. Mary wins at sisterly rivalry and gets to live in the countryside with her family, but the rest of her evil family is destroyed. End of novel, lessons of rivalry and ambition learned. Off the bat, one of the first issues with that of Mary Boleyn is that she's presented as essentially a modern mother. This is a fairly good narrative choice. Gregory wants readers to identify themselves with Mary, who stands opposed to the evils of the Tudor court and the cold ruthlessness of her sister. She also considers Mary Boleyn one of her personal heroines, a statement that I find bizarre for so many reasons that I cannot begin to get into them. Mary Boleyn? A personal heroine? For what? Who actually loves and cares for her children. Much is made how every other woman, including Mary's mother and her sister, despise the very idea of children and just don't understand why Mary should care, when it's likely that her children will just die anyway. Mary's just that one special woman who thinks that it's worthwhile to be invested in children because, along with Catherine of Aragon, she's the one good woman in the whole Tudor world. This idea that parents were generally uninterested in the existence of their children and had no real love for them is based in the work of Lawrence Stone, most famously his The Family, Sex and Marriage in England, 1500 to 1800, published in 1977. Catch the date? Yeah, it's a pretty old work, and his ideas have been picked apart and improved in the 40 years since his ideas were published, most notably from the beginning of the 1980s. People have revised and re-revised how the Tudors viewed the family and their children a lot since then, and I don't know why Gregory insists on still using this book. Parenting styles in the 16th century were vastly different to how we parent today. I can see this just in my degree. I worked with a single mother who liked to explain in detail how cruel she personally felt Tudor parents were because, she really loved her children. But it's complete nonsense to present modern women as being inherently more loving than Tudor parents because our society operates under vastly different frameworks. Modern parents seek to be actively involved in their children's lives, to shape and value them as an individual according to our modern values and what we admire and want them to achieve. Our society is individualistic. We value the experience, rights and success of the individual. However, Tudors lived in a societal framework. Value came from society and your role as part of the common weal, contributing to the health, happiness and safety of your community. So Tudor parents brought up their children to seek their value in their place and their duties within the common weal, to be obedient, compliant and fulfilling duties in the hierarchy that they lived. Tudor parents didn't love their children any less than parents now, but being a good Tudor parent required a lot different discipline and style than being a good modern parent. Let's take a few examples from the book. From the start of Mary having children, she resents not being able to breastfeed her babies, and the women around her just don't understand. Doctors of the 16th century did actually advise and try to get noble women to breastfeed their own children, but generally women of Mary's status would have had their children fed by a wet nurse. In the book, it's construed as mothers just not being able to love their children. In reality, it was medically believed that babies took the qualities of the women who breastfed them. So noble women would try to get their children a leg up in life by hiring women with the best qualities to breastfeed them. Sort of like a modern woman hiring a private tutor for little Timmy to get a head start on his GCSE exams. Being a woman of Mary Boleyn's station also meant she had to be present and working fairly quickly after birth, whether in the house, as detailed in my Desperate Tudor Housewives video, or by being present in a social sense, as Mary would have to be as a serving woman to Catherine of Aragon, the Queen. It wasn't a schedule that left a lot of time to take a break 8 to 12 times a day to feed a baby. So not parental neglect, but different parenting needs. At another point in the book, Anne cannot comprehend her sister loving her children. After all, children just die off anyway, so there's no point in having affection for them. Not only does it draw a quick contrast between Mary, modern everyday woman who is good, and Anne, cold, heartless bitch monster who is wicked, but it's a complete misunderstanding of how religious belief impacted daily life for women in the 16th century. Yes, it was more likely for children to die. 1 in 5 children died before the age of 10, and death could come very swiftly and suddenly. It does not mean that parents decided to just not love their children. Moving aside from how ridiculous it would be to not love your children and then start loving them at the age of 10, what would you do after they've passed through the danger zone? Just start loving them all of a sudden. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of how grief worked in the Tudor period. God was seen as being an active agent in people's lives and dictated events according to his divine plan. If your baby died, it was because God wanted it to happen. It's a pretty awful thought, but it's what they believed. One of the key virtues of Tudor England was that of resignation in the face of God's will, of accepting God's decisions and trying to find solace in knowing that there was a reason why the inexplicable or awful happened. Again, not parental neglect or lack of care, but a different framework for understanding grief and pain. One last example before I recount every single instance of people behaving like aliens in this novel. Mary is horrified to find that her babies, a few weeks after birth, are suddenly gone. They are whisked away to the countryside, and aside from a few weeks out of the year, Mary's not allowed to have any contact with them at all, and they're kept separate from her. And this was perfectly normal. Mary works at the ever-moving court of Henry VIII, a loose consortium of around 1,000 to 2,000 people, and I can't imagine a worse environment for trying to bring up like a newborn baby. Mary has a job, serving the Queen, and cannot exactly be involved in the day-to-day life of her children as we might want to now. Court is also a notoriously unhealthy place to be. You've got a few thousand people confined in a small area, staying up all night, eating the richest of foods, drinking a lot, and making a place where very small children are not welcome and are not going to be particularly healthy. Either way, Tudor parents would send their children away to serve and learn at the household of another. Parenting advice of the age said that parents would love their children too much, not be strict enough, not provide proper boundaries. The thing that Gregory presents as being done because 16th century mothers were incapable of love was actually done because parents were thought to be too soft and loving towards their children. But I guess it's just easier to have Mary as the sole loving parent in the whole of Tudor England. Also, having Mary Boleyn as this naive and intellectually inferior 14-year-old having sex with a 30-year-old man is a narrative decision that only gets weirder as I get older. The Other Boleyn Girl presents Henry VIII as this unstoppable sex machine who tends to see women only as these things to have sex with, be mildly interested in, and then, move on right away. Women come and go, all vying for his interest and the chance to rise up to some sort of high position, even though a mistress had never supplanted a reigning queen in English history at that point, and only 2 non-royal women had become queens. His interest in Anne only lasts as long as she refuses to have sex with him, and once it's done, Henry emotionally moves on and starts his mission to fuck the world all over again. I mean, who can resist the raw sexual charismatic power of a king, especially when he's portrayed by an actor like Eric Bana? I don't understand if it's Jared Harris, but as far as casting decisions go, this is one of the most baffling in recent history. Moving on, how much of Gregory's view of Henry is based on reality? After decades of being presented this view of Henry VIII as a womanising nymphomaniac with no means to control himself, would it surprise you that he probably wasn't? Yes, Henry had 6 wives and his life seemed to revolve around women, but the evidence of him being an unstoppable sex maniac is pretty thin on the ground. In fact, the evidence we have of Henry's life suggests that he was much more conventional and boring in terms of his sex life and views of romance. He liked chivalric romance and the art of falling in love, and he liked to romance women that he was comfortable around, women who he'd either known for a long time or were part of his inner circle. Catherine of Aragon. Henry knew her from literal childhood. Anne Boleyn. Her parents were at Henry's court from his coronation. Her brother was at court from 1509. She was at court from 1522. Jane Seymour. Her father was a diplomat to Henry and she served at court from at least 1532, perhaps even 1527. Catherine Howard. Her family was extremely well known to Henry, although he did pretty much marry her the same year he met her. Catherine Parr. Her father worked for Henry, her mother worked for Catherine of Aragon, and she served in the household of Henry's daughter Mary. Anne of Cleves was the only traditional royal stranger match that Henry made, and it's worth noting his interest in her stopped abruptly when she rejected his attempts at courtly romance. Henry married women he had a connection with for a time before considering them as a wife. He seems to have had this need for love, courtship, companionship, and it didn't really work out for him or his wives based on how he actually behaved, but Henry liked falling in love. He wanted a marriage based on attraction and mutually shared interest, and he liked courtly romance. What about those famous mistresses? That Henry had mistresses is part of the historical record, although he never had an official mistress like, say, the kings of France would have. There are 3 confirmed mistresses and around 12 other women who have been linked with Henry. The links between Henry and those 12 women are fairly dubious in my opinion. Henry was extremely private and discreet about his life outside of affairs of state, and it's generally only by accident that we know anything about Henry having affairs outside of marriage, aside from Anne Boleyn. He was relatively chaste and moderate in his romantic pursuits, and he didn't really publicise his out-of-marriage actions. Bessie Blount was the first of Henry's mistresses and is mentioned briefly in The Other Boleyn Girl. She had a relationship with Henry for an unknown length of time. Kelly Hart, in her work The Mistresses of Henry VIII, states that the affair began around 1514 or 1515 and lasted until about 1519 or 1520, but John Guy, in Children of Henry VIII, believes that the affair started around 1518. The fact that we don't even know how and when this affair started and ended sort of tells you how guarded Henry was about conducting affairs outside of marriage. A huge difference from how open he is presented as just sleeping around as much as possible in the novel to the point of openly insulting his wives. Bessie Blount is only known to us because she had Henry's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, a child who was acknowledged by Henry and treated like a natural-born son, but only after 1525. He did have Thomas Wolsey as a godparent. He was brought up as a royal child and elevated to the status of Duke of Richmond and Surrey, but his birth was so secretive that no one even knew about it until he was elevated to the Duke of Richmond. Unlike when Mary has Henry's children in the book and everyone knows about it and doesn't bother to keep it a secret that he fathered them. Next known mistress is, of course, our protagonist Mary Boleyn. Far from being this naive and otherworldly and wide-eyed 14-year-old, Mary in real life had supposedly already had an affair with Francis I of France. who was an unstoppable sex chad far more than Henry, having 2 official mistresses and is supposed to have died of complications of syphilis. Although the evidence of this affair is pretty flimsy, and to me seems more like a way to slander the Boleyn family after the fact. Mary returned to England after serving as a maid of honour to the Queen of France in 1519 and married William Carey in 1520. She had some sort of sexual contact with Henry at some point. And yeah, it is that vague. We know that they had some sort of sexual interaction at some point because Henry's dispensation to marry Anne sent to Pope Clement VII makes an oblique reference to it. Poe's bull of dispensation for Henry VIII, in case his marriage with Catherine, his brother's widow, be pronounced unlawful, to marry another, even if she have contracted marriage with another man, provided it be not consummated, and even if she be of the 2nd degree of consanguinity, or the 1st degree of affinity, quacam licto sio illicio coitu, from any illicit or licit intercourse, in order to prevent uncertainty in the succession, which in past times has been the occasion of war. At some point, Henry and Mary had some sort of illicit intercourse that would have prohibited Anne from marrying Henry. However, it is a huge leap of logic to take that vague phrasing and spin it into this amazing affair that lasted 8 years, 2 children, and the idea that Henry might have married Mary Boleyn instead. There is every possibility that Mary and Henry had their affair in the year before she was married. There were gifts made to her husband at the time of marriage and to Mary's father, so it could be possible that it was repaying them for Henry's interest, or that the affair happened round about the start of her marriage, which does feel like a bit of a dick move to poach your friend's wife right at the point they get married. But we just don't know. We know absolutely nothing about the extent of Henry and Mary's sexual connection. Philippa Gregory points to the existence of the vessel the Mary Boleyn as proof of the longevity and seriousness of her and Henry's affair, but this is a myth from older biographies that has been disproved in revised works. David Lode's The Boleyns disproves this entirely, as no such ship existed in the inventory of Henry's navy at the time. Any ship called the Mary Boleyn, if it existed, would have been property of the Boleyn family, and the cautious Henry, who managed to conceal the birth of his illegitimate child so well that it wasn't mentioned for years, would never do something as obvious as naming a ship after a woman he was having a casual fling with. There's nothing to suggest that Henry and Mary had a meaningful or significant affair. Well, other than Philippa's assertion that Catherine and Henry Carey were actually the children of Henry VIII. This idea has very little evidence to support it, although you will find historians who advocate for this theory. I personally don't. If Henry and Mary had a sexual affair around 1519 or 1520, it's a huge leap of logic to then assume that her children, born in 1524 and 1526, were actually the children of Henry VIII. Even if their affair lasted that long or was that serious, it seems strange that Henry would allow another man to be considered the father of his children when he did nothing but heap accolades and money onto his other bastard son. Why reward one son and not another? English kings have tended to acknowledge their bastard children. Henry even had an uncle, Arthur Lord Lisle, who was illegitimate and lived as part of the royal court. It makes less sense that Henry and Mary had this ongoing long-standing affair, as by the birth of Mary's second child, Henry had already started openly courting Anne. And it is a plot point in the book, but seeing as having a relationship with Mary prevents him from marrying Anne, it seems hilarious that he'd be trying to balance a relationship with both of them at the same time. A relationship balance, I must note, that does not appear in any contemporary court documents or records of the time. Like, everyone knew about Henry's interest in Anne, but were unable to notice he was boffing her sister at the exact same time. Some people argue that Catherine Carey's children look like Elizabeth I as proof they are half-sisters, but seeing as nearly every noblewoman tried to make themselves look like Elizabeth because it was fashionable, that is proof of nothing but that all women tried to look like pale-faced gingers at Elizabeth's court. Are all these children yours, Henry? Did you fuck everyone's mom? The phrasing illicit intercourse is also vague enough to cover just about any kind of what Jeremy Kyle would call sexual contact. Good natural sex at this time was sex between husband and wife that could conceive a child. Bad, illicit, unnatural sex was classified as sodomy and covered anything sexual that meant that a child could not be conceived. Anything that wasn't straightforward missionary sex, basically. And we know that people in the 16th century got up to all sorts of naughty, sexy things because they left us their confessions and penance records of what exactly they got up to together. So it's entirely within the realms of possibility that the only relationship Mary and Henry had was more akin to a quick fumble at the club rather than an astounding and dazzling love affair. The idea of what constitutes sexual intimacy is different in the Tudor age than now. The last of Henry's recorded mistresses is Margaret or Mary Shelton. The two are actually sisters, the daughters of Anne's aunt, Anne, the sister of Thomas Boleyn. But no one's actually sure which one had the supposed affair with Henry. We only know that Eustace Chapuis reported that Henry had an affair with a Mistress Shelton from February 1535 for about 6 months. There's no other information or confirmation other than that brief snippet of gossip, which may or may not be true. It may have been a physical affair or a courtly romance. And from that point, Henry doesn't appear to have had affairs with any other women that are confirmed in the historical record. For the most part, Henry married the women that he fell in love with, and if he did spend his days sexually conquering all the women around him, there's not a lot of evidence for it. Gregory's idea of a Henry who was sort of politically incompetent, unintelligent, and unconcerned with life around him other than whether or not he can fuck it, bears pretty much no resemblance to the person that Henry VIII actually was and how he related to the women around him. She also thinks that he went completely and totally insane, which is a great excuse for not having to write consistent characterization and motivation for a character, because they can do whatever you want and you can just call them crazy. Other than Mary and Anne moving in different social circles at court, there's nothing to suggest that Mary and Anne had this intense personal rivalry because of Anne being a horrendous, huge bitch monster. Fun fact, Robin Maxwell, the novelist who specialises in the Tudor period, refused to write a quote for the blurb of the Other Boleyn Girl because of Anne being characterised as vicious. It's literary fantasy, but it does make for a strong, relatable dynamic. Women are encouraged to see each other as competitors. It's a phenomenon that contemporary female readers would be aware of and recognise in how Anne and Mary are encouraged to play off each other and antagonise the other. Mary in the book is portrayed as being the younger and less intelligent of the sisters. In actuality, we have no idea about the birth order of the Boleyn children. Their birth dates were unrecorded. Mary, Anne and George could have been born any time from around 1499 to about 1508. Although most historians would put Mary as being born around 1499 to 1500, George in 1504, and Anne either in 1501 or 1507, it's not quite clear. Mary being married first and her son laying official claim to the Boleyn lands and titles would put her as the eldest child. She was also just as educated as her sister, as Mary served at the French court and the English court alongside her sister. But there is something telling about how the reader is supposed to relate to Mary, who constantly talks about her lack of education, her desire to be nothing more than a homemaker and a mother, and her utter ineptitude when it comes to understanding politics or any interest in religious reform, and that Anne is presented as this dark figure who's cold and consumed with ambition, overly educated and too interested in serious matters, and that's why she has to die. I guess the lesson is that being intelligent makes you sort of deserve to get your head cut off by your cheating husband. This is perhaps the most controversial part of the Other Boleyn Girl. Gregory took Aretha M. Warnick's theories and just sort of ran with them, presenting them as being completely accurate and historically valid. She really believes them. Which is like, no. Warnick's ideas are not widely accepted by her peers and are not backed up with much, if any, evidence. Let's split this up into two ideas. Firstly, the idea that Anne Boleyn had this circle of gay buddies around her that caused so much scandal that they had to be executed by Henry's government for being too gay. I have no doubt that there must have been people who would identify as gay if they lived now who were at Henry's court, but we have no idea who they were. Warnick believes that the men accused of being lovers of Anne Boleyn were executed because there was this cloud of suspicion of them being gay, and this has created a modern myth that George Boleyn was charged with sodomy as well as treason. This is a lie. None of the men brought down by the fall of Anne Boleyn were charged with sodomy or buggery, and there were no contemporary rumours of homosexuality around any of them. They died along with Anne, most likely as they were members of the Boleyn faction, if you choose to believe in factional politics of the Tudor court, and because they were seen as being expendable in smearing and executing Anne. Alison Weir has recently brought up the idea of George being gay again recently, and also this idea that George Boleyn was this rapist, but there's no evidence for any of this. In fact, it was widely accepted at court that George Boleyn was entirely innocent of any charge levied against him. Even his enemies, like Eustace Chapuis, presumed that he would be acquitted at trial, as he was a well-liked and respected figure at court. Fun fact, Jane Boleyn, who is another historical figure Gregory has decided was crazy, did not actually offer up evidence against her husband or at any of the trials of those convicted alongside Anne. The only evidence from Jane Boleyn was that she repeated something Anne had told her, that Henry was not able to satisfy a woman and he had neither capacity nor virility, i.e. he couldn't get a boner. So the idea that Jane Boleyn was this weird, depraved, insane voyeur who hated her husband is based on nothing other than a common belief that Jane was just this vindictive wife who brought down her family. Gregory posits that, based on Warnock's work, Anne Boleyn miscarried a deformed fetus and it created an atmosphere where Henry could accuse her of witchcraft and perverse sexual practice. Although Warnock has made every effort to not be associated with this book and to distance herself from Gregory, there is no evidence that Anne's last miscarriage in 1536 in any way involved a fetus with physical deformity.
Anne miscarries a baby, and it's inspected by a midwife who says that it was a boy, but it's malformed. Now, that's of enormous importance. I'm certain that he feels that. It may be that he goes further and believes that his wife is a witch.
There's no indication in the contemporary records that this was anything other than a normal pregnancy with a sad end. The idea that Anne was delivered of a shapeless mass of flesh comes along 40 years later, and a great edifice of speculation has been built up on this, so that it's quite hard to remember that there is no evidence at the root of it all. This hypothesis, let's call it, is so sensational, so hair-raising, and of course it's attractive to novelists.
Henry did declare that he had been seduced by sortilège, which is a French term that can mean either deception or spells. But if there's this frenzy about ill omens, magic and witchcraft when Anne was arrested on the 2nd of May 1536, it had completely faded by the 15th of May when Anne was charged with just treason, incest and adultery. She was never accused of being a witch and never tried on charges of witchcraft. In fact, England had no witchcraft laws at the time of Anne's death. The first law against witchcraft was put in the statute books in 1542. So if Henry was in this frenzy of believing Anne was this evil witch, he was so concerned that he made it illegal 6 years after her death. Warnock's work has been widely discredited, and Gregory, historian that she claims to be, should have picked up on that instead of reproducing it, presenting it, and believing it to be completely fact.
To have an incestuous relationship with her brother seems to most modern minds really most unlikely and very troubling. They weren't brought up as brother and sister at all. She was away to France, so they meet pretty well as strangers. We certainly know that Anne is determined enough to take extraordinary decisions. You're talking about someone very, very ruthless indeed. So I think it's perfectly possible to imagine that they might decide to have intercourse in order to conceive a child, especially if, as we know, they believe that the king was incapable of fathering a child. In those circumstances, I think she's capable of it.
I'd ask you to think of the cure and the illness. My husband is only occasionally potent. I better have sex with my own brother in order to produce a son that he can then believe is his. It doesn't quite work, I think, as an argument. No matter how desperate you are, you don't have sex with your own brother.
Amongst Gregory's strengths as a writer is her ability to imply details that seem intimate to everyday and courtly life in the 16th century, for creating strong emotional connections between characters, the chemistry in her romance, and dialogue. I would advise reading her works for those interested in reading or writing historical fiction before she started churning out lightly edited, repetitive novels based on her own interpretation of historical fact. That said, The Other Boleyn Girl feels weak as a historical version of Anne Boleyn's downfall because of focusing on Mary, who is characterised as being oblivious to politics and endearingly stupid, because events outside of the Boleyn's inner circle aren't really mentioned or drawn attention to. Thomas Cromwell, who was a pretty key figure in the downfall of Anne Boleyn, just appears suddenly, and no comment is made on who he is and the role he plays in Henry's government or Anne's household. Thomas Cranmer, who rose up to be Archbishop of Canterbury and essentially head of the English Church alongside Henry because of support from Anne Boleyn and her family, also just appears, and no comment is made of his connections to Anne and her interest in religious reform. But Mary, standing for the modern woman, doesn't interest herself with politics, and the role of these men in Anne's life is just not there in the book. After all, Mary's content with her life and proud of being uneducated, and that's what Gregory finds personally heroic. The Seymours are also consistently presented as being these great ancestral enemies of the Boleyns because, you know, Jane replaced Anne. But that comes from nothing. The Boleyns and Seymours did not spend years hating each other in some sort of sharks versus jets dance Tudor court rivalry. This is a concept called teleology, where history is interpreted by your knowledge of what actually happens to these people and seeing it through the lens of what you know will happen in the end. It's a trap that Gregory frequently falls into, and not just in this work. I first read The Other Boleyn Girl when I was about 13, and I fell in love with it. I immediately sought out all other works by Philippa Gregory that I could get my hands on and devoured them all. I do reread it about once a year because how Gregory details life in the 16th century and how she writes dialogue is something that I find to be inspirational and fundamental in how I address my own fiction writing. And it is an enjoyable read. At 13, however, I believed I was reading something better than just historical fiction because it was backed up by research, and it made me feel that I was being a historian, that I was actively engaging with the world of the Tudor court by reading this book that wasn't just trashy fiction. I felt that I was learning by reading it, and I honestly believed that Gregory was just writing this lightly fictional version of the truth. Then I actually studied history, and I worked with real historians, and I specialised in Henrician politics and Elizabethan propaganda, and I look back at how Gregory seems to genuinely believe that she's creating this valid historical analysis, and I get really frustrated. Historical research makes a good backdrop for historical fiction, and historical fiction doesn't have to be 100% accurate all the time if the changes and interpretations serve the story. Fiction doesn't have to reflect the real world perfectly to create a valid, emotional, meaningful work. An Instance of the Finger Post features real-life figures but focuses on a fictional criminal case, and it highlights the confusion, the xenophobia and the religious turmoil of the post-English Civil War era. Wolf Hall presents Thomas Cromwell as this friendly, pragmatic everyman just trying to find his way by being swept away by Tudor politics, but also trying to get revenge and aid the Reformation. A very different interpretation of the person Thomas Cromwell actually was, but it provides a landing point for readers to better understand the world of Henrician politics. Was Thomas Cromwell actually just this nice cuddly guy that all the ladies wanted to love? No. But Mantell's Cromwell is well written, compelling, and she never presents herself as being a historian writing complete 100% accurate things in her novels. Philippa Gregory sells a charade that she seems to actually believe, that she's an academic, that her books are great works of historical fact, and she's doing historically important work. But her books are fiction, and that's fine. When she actually puts effort into her fiction, she is excellent at drawing attention to the experiences of women, the feeling of living in a different time and age, and really immersive sensory detail. Her books don't need to be dressed up as historical fact to add this aura of prestige, to differentiate them from those Jean Plaidy style novels. They're strong enough historical fiction. The Queen's Fool, the sequel to The Other Boleyn Girl, is a far superior work that highlights the experiences of Jewish women in 16th century England. A really important work that calls attention to a wider world beyond just rich, white, privileged women. It's important as fiction in a genre that overwhelmingly doesn't focus on the lives of minorities or those facing oppression at historical points. Works of fiction can have more impact and reach the people that need and appreciate them most than pretending to be a historian just for the sake of TV prestige. Also, all the adaptations of Gregory's novels are pretty uniformly terrible, but for different new reasons with each one, and her works are a hotbed of misogyny, weird Madonna whore dichotomies, and just genuinely insulting insinuations about the mentally ill. Also, magic is real in her world, and she never addresses it. So, that's what's fact and fiction in The Other Boleyn Girl. If you liked, like, share, subscribe, and all that, support my Ko-fi page and tip me to support future video essays and other takedowns of highly successful and popular authors that I could never be. I also have an Amazon wish list of research materials I'd like to have bought for me for future videos. If you're interested in the life of Anne Boleyn, I'd recommend Eric Ives's biography as being pretty much the definitive work on Anne Boleyn currently, although I'm not too convinced about his work on factional politics, but it's still a really immersive and thorough work looking at all the evidence we have for Anne Boleyn. I personally don't like much of Alison Weir's work, as she tends to argue some pretty out there stuff, but she's written a biography of Mary Boleyn that's pretty well peer-reviewed. There's, I think, a lot of guesswork in it, but there's little of anything that we conclusively know about Mary. Her work on Anne Boleyn's last days in the Tower is very detailed on just focusing on what happened right at the end, as is Susanna Lipscomb's 1536. David Starkey and Antonia Fraser's Six Wives biographies are a good place to start if you're interested in any of Henry's wives, but both of those works are a little old-fashioned by now. There's been a lot of revised and reworked biographies that just focus on the different wives separately, but it's a good place to start. David Lloyd's The Boleyns, Rise and Fall of a Tudor Family is a good overview of the whole family, but doesn't focus especially in on Anne herself. I haven't read Elizabeth Norton's work on Anne Boleyn. It's actually in the post right now. It didn't quite arrive in time. But as I do highly recommend her work on the lives of Tudor women, I would suggest that you look out for it. Her work on Anne Boleyn has been very positively received by other historians. Avoid the work of G.W. Bernard like the plague.